Welcome to American Indian and Alaska Native Living, a program designed to educate and inspire listeners throughout Indian country. American Indian and Alaska Native Living is hosted by Dr. David DeRose, a board-certified specialist in both internal medicine and preventive medicine. Dr. DeRose has a wide range of experience with Native health issues, and he is here today to help you learn more about your health. Here is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome to American Indian and Alaska Native Living. I'm Dr. David DeRose. Today I'm at a venue in Maryland. It's Columbia, Maryland, and I'm at a venue where people have been getting training in how to facilitate community programs. With me is one of the individuals who led a group trying to help them with one of the most challenging skills that we find in communities. She's Teresa Nelson. She's a registered nurse by training, but Teresa, you've moved into a different area as far as impacting communities. Tell us a little bit about what you were teaching folks here in this venue.
Thank you, Dr. DeRose. I am delighted to be here. And yes, I am in a little different place. As a registered nurse, I worked many years, but I migrated into the area of spiritual care. And I worked as a staff chaplain for 10 years. And during that time, I began to get an increasing desire to reach out to a certain population of people that I saw were in so much pain and suffering. Those who had experienced a significant loss in their lives and left them grieving. And I wanted to see what I could do to help them. And so it finds me where I am today, facilitating a seminar, helping to train others who are interested in facilitating peer support grief groups in their community.
It's an amazing thing. You come from a background of chaplaincy work in hospitals. I mean, so much of the focus is on the patient, but you, with your heart for the family, you saw what they were going through, not just what the individual was. And this work is really the outgrowth of that experience.
Is correct. And I must tell you that on a personal level, I was very motivated to do that because I experienced my first really significant loss when my mother died. And she died when I was a very young adult. I was a newlywed, and this was a good while ago. And there was no one to help us. And she died, and there was no hospice. There were no support groups. And I describe it as like a bomb went off in our home, relationally, emotionally, and mentally. People wanted to help, but there really wasn't anyone around to help. And so this passion to reach out to those really has a very personal attachment because I don't want anyone to have to go through that alone. I don't want them to have to experience this kind of loss alone. I want them to be companioned through their grief. And I've seen what kind of healing can happen when people who have losses gather together, and the way that they care and support one another is quite remarkable.
One of the things I love about what you're doing, Teresa, is you and the team that you've worked with have put together some very practical, attractive, relatively simple materials, but yet you've got a lot of practical things packed into them. And I know as health professionals, that's one of the big challenges we have. Sometimes the patients say, well, yeah, that doctor is really smart, but I don't understand anything he said. So you can take all kinds of information, and if it's not usable, understandable, it's not too helpful. What kind of feedback, as you were piloting these relatively new materials, have you gotten from actual participants?
Well, first of all, we have gotten really good feedback from the material, and the material is created so that you don't have to be a professional to do this. You just have to have a caring heart and a few simple skills, a little bit of knowledge about how to conduct a small group. But we wanted to make this accessible so that anyone who had a desire and was willing to receive a little bit of training and could use the materials. So far, we've had a very good response to the material.
So what we want to do in this program is help you. If you're dealing with grief, if there have been challenges that you've experienced in life, we want to give you some tools, some insights into what you're dealing with. If you're not going through that right now, it's likely someone in your tribe, in your family, in your community, at your workplace is dealing with some of that. We want to help you be more empathetic, give you more insights. And so that is really the focus of this program. Teresa, the program that you have developed, you've got a simple name for it and then a longer subtitle. Tell us what those are and why they're significant.
The title of the materials that we use is called Seasons because we realize that we can go through an intense period where our hearts are just broken and we're devastated with loss. And that's a very significant season, but we don't have to stay there. So Seasons is subtitled Moving Through the Changes of Grief and Loss. it in itself indicates that, yes, we're grieving, but we're going to move because our lives are going to change from that loss. And we want to help people who are grieving to know and understand that this kind of loss, they don't have to carry this with them forever. So we like the seasons name because just like winter, spring, fall, summer, those seasons come and go. And I want to make it clear, grief is not measured in the seasons of nature because your season is very individual and very unique. And so to put a timeline on grief is really a misunderstanding. And to compare your grief to someone else is not advisable because everybody grieves differently. Every loss is unique. And we want to let people grieve in their own timeline. But it is called seasons for a reason.
I love this point. I think this is a great place to start because so often, whatever we deal with, any kind of human loss, any kind of human challenge, I think sometimes the people who are the most dangerous as far as coming alongside of us are the people who've been there before, and they feel like they can tell us how to do it. I see this in the addiction community. I see it with patients. Oh, well, I took care of my diabetes this way. This is all you have to do. And it can be the same in the grief world. Like, why are you still mourning? Get over this. My husband died, and, a month later I was back to normal. Have you seen that being a special stressor for people going through the grieving process?
I have. You probably would be, well, maybe you wouldn't be shocked by hear some of the responses that I come back from people who are in grief that tell me their friends or family say to them that are not helpful at all. In fact, they're hurtful. And so for somebody to compare their grief to somebody else's is just not appropriate for the griever. And so that's the kind of education when they realize that, yes, this person, maybe they're trying to help, but it's not real helpful. And what I've come to realize is that I learn the most from grievers. Anything that I've learned and can share with somebody else, I've picked up from somebody else that I have walked with through their grief process and have learned so much. They'll teach you what to say and don't say if you listen.
Help us, because there's a lot of folks listening in, and it might help some other people who are grieving to avoid some of that stress. What kind of things should we not say? And maybe this is the flip side of it, Teresa, because I know sometimes people just avoid individuals who have lost because they don't know what to say. Help us through this process. If I know someone who's recently experienced the loss of a loved one, let's say, what should I do? What shouldn't I do?
Well, one thing I will say that I just heard in the training that we provided, because even the trainers, the facilitators, I've experienced grief, you've experienced grief. Grief is a normal response to any time we experience a significant loss. And one of them said they have learned to never say, I know how you feel. Because you don't know how they feel. And she learned that. She said she used to say that to people. And she thought she was a pretty good helper with people who were grieving. But then she experienced her own significant loss. And she learned that was not helpful. That did not help at all.
Good. Well, so thank you for that insight. Well, let's look at some other practical things, because I've got the Seasons Moving Through the Changes of Grief and Loss participant guide in front of me. And like I mentioned, it's very attractively laid out. It's simple. There's places where you can take notes and write. And there's a number of practical things here. One of the things that first jumped out at me, Teresa, early in your materials is you have several bullet points that you call suggestions for processing your grief. So tell us a little bit about why this is important and what are some of the lessons for us.
The bottom line is grief is normal and everyone experiences grief. But Dr. DeRose, we don't often take the time to mourn. And we help our participants to understand the difference between grieving and mourning, because we're going to grieve, but not everyone takes the time to mourn. So these little suggestions for processing grief is helping them to understand the needs and what is important for them to be able to really mourn their loss. And unfortunately, a lot of us in our culture have not really learned because we haven't seen that modeled. For many families, they did a lot of stuffing. They just moved on and they didn't take the time to really express. And so that's one of the things that when you go to a grief group, such as what is provided, that we actually stop and take the time to process our grief. And so we're trying to give them pointers on how to face their grief, but it's hard because it's so painful. So for many of us, we just want to run away from it. And when we run away from it, it doesn't work so well because we find that we stuff our pain by doing oftentimes some very unhealthy things. And I'm not just talking about drugs or alcohol, because that is one way that I think sometimes people do stuff. But we can also stuff our pain through just getting busy and work. They say, well, time heals all wounds. Well, it's possible we do need some time, but it's what we do with that time and how we take time to process that loss.
Well, let's get to this distinction then, because you mentioned that there's a difference between mourning and grief. And I think a lot of folks are saying, how are they different? What's different? Help us understand, Teresa.
Grief really is something that comes naturally. You don't have to do anything. You just have, because that's a normal response. You look at a little baby or a toddler, and when you take something away from them that they don't want you to take away from, what do? They start crying and they protest. They don't like it because that's a little mini loss for them. They want that toy. So that's a grief. You see that in children. Children actually do very well at expressing their grief.
Okay.
And mourning is that exact thing. It is expressing your grief, talking, crying, sighing, taking time to remember, embracing the pain. Maybe some of our listeners have heard the expression, you have to feel to heal. And when you don't take time to really feel the pain, you can't move to a place of joy and peace. And we all want to be there, but we have to walk through that pain to get there. Because if you shut down your feelings that are painful and you want to avoid, you also shut the door to joy. Because you just shut everything down and then you numb yourself up to what the potential is for you to experience once you pass through this season.
It's interesting you mention this because I've heard patients describe the same phenomenon. You talk about stuffing things, but many patients end up on medications. And I've heard patients say, in fact, it was probably just a week or two ago, that there was a patient in my practice where she was telling me this story. And I don't think it was in the context of grief, but she said, I was put on these antidepressants and they helped me with my depression, but they also blunted my emotions. So it was making this connection between, yes, you're not living in the pain maybe of the grief, but you're also not experiencing joy. And she was making that connection with a medication that was prescribed. Of course, we're not trying to discourage people from taking medication if they need it, right?
Yes, there is a season for everything. So we try to remember balance. And we just encourage people that when they feel like they can embrace the pain of the loss, that they do that. And they do that with the support of others. We really encourage them to not isolate. There's a difference between solitude and isolating. I need some time to myself. I think we all need some time to ourselves. But when we isolate, we basically rob ourselves of the ability to engage when we're ready to, because we're actually hiding from something that we don't want to face. And many of the people who come to the grief group talk about the fact that before they came, they were isolating and they were numbing. Maybe they were just sitting in front of the TV all day. What they call, I just was spacing out in front of the TV. It was all I could do. And you can speak much more experience about clinical depression and the depression that comes from a circumstance of grief. So we recognize there are some commonalities. Clinical depression, certainly people are grieving can have that. But a lot of the depression that comes from grieving is a circumstantial one and can be healed really through taking time to mourn.
We want to speak about this mourning process. I know in your resources, you talk about some of the needs that people have while they're going through mourning, and we want to cover that in our next segment. If someone says, I'd really like to learn more about this, maybe they want to facilitate the programs themselves, maybe they want to get a hold of the materials, is there a single point of contact? Is it best to reach out to you? Is there some group that sells the materials? I know this isn't the purpose of the show, but I know a lot of times when we speak about a resource, people are saying, how do I connect with that? Is there a simple answer?
Well, the material that I use is designed to help people who want to facilitate a grief support group. So if there's someone in the audience that needs to know about that, they can contact Advent Source, go to the website and get the material. For general grief support, I would encourage them to contact local areas to see where grief support groups are being held and to join one of those groups.
Okay, we'll give you more information about contact information. We've got to step away briefly. I'm Dr. David DeRose. Teresa Nelson, my guest. We will continue with practical strategies to help you in your times of challenge and grief. I'm Dr. DeRose. Stay by.
Today's broadcast has been pre-recorded. However, if you have questions about today's show or would like further information, please reach out to us on the web at aianl.org. That stands for American Indian Alaska Native Living. Again, aianl.org. Or you can call us at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. We'll be right back after this.
We are strong, we are resilient, and we will get through this together. But these are stressful times, and it's important to also practice good self-care. It's normal to feel overwhelmed, anxious, or afraid, but there is hope. Reach out to someone, connect with your friends, stay in touch with your community, and know that you are not alone. Learn more at wearebroadcasters.com/hope. Furnished by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
When Jim died, I wondered if I would be able to keep the farm. Then I heard about the USDA's loan program for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. It's for women and minorities who may be having trouble getting credit. Once I was approved, the USDA's Farm Service Agency helped me get the credit I needed. Now I don't have to sell, and I can pass the farm down to my kids the way Jim's dad passed it down to him. I know he'd like that.
Contact your local USDA Service Center or visit www.fsa.usda.gov.
Social Security is with you through life's journey from birth to retirement. As your life changes year to year, so do your needs. For over 80 years, Social Security has helped to meet your needs and is committed to improving access to the services that make a difference in your life. Today, you can verify your earnings, estimate your future benefits, apply for retirement, manage your benefits, and even change your address, all from the comfort of your home. Social Security's online services help put you in control with secure access to your information anytime, anywhere, allowing you to spend more time with family, friends, or simply just enjoying the day. Social Security, securing today and tomorrow. See what you can do online at socialsecurity.gov.
Produced at U.S. taxpayer expense.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back to American Indian and Alaska Native Living. If the ambiance is a little bit different in this segment, we've actually moved out of the venue where the conference was, and we're actually outdoors. So the birds are finding this a nice venue as well. It's a nice day here at the end of April in 2024 when we're recording this show. And we're also not far from a freeway, so we may get some interesting noise from there. But just to give you a little bit of a feel for the environment here in Columbia, Maryland, where Teresa has just finished training a group of professionals and community leaders on a program called Seasons, moving through the changes of grief and loss. And so, Teresa, for some who are just maybe jumping onto the program, they haven't been with us from the top of the hour, they're very interested in grief and helping people through the grieving process. You have shared with us where people can get these materials, but we really didn't give the website. So who is it that's distributing these materials, and how can someone get in touch with them?
Well, it's a publishing distributing company called adventsource.org. So if you go to that website, and just do a search. If you search for Seasons and enter in maybe Seasons and grief, it'll pull it up right away. And it's rather inexpensive, but it's for people that are wanting help in starting a peer grief support group in their community, in the area where they are. You get a group of 3 or 4 or more people together. It's amazing what happens when they are just simply given the space, the safety, time to be able to talk about their loss. It is healing. And so that's what we're trying to build, is more of these kinds of groups where people can come together and process their loss and begin that moving forward with their lives.
So now, Teresa, if I understand this correctly, this is not a program that's especially designed for health professionals or psychologists or clinical social workers. This is designed for anyone to give them the tools to lead a support group. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct. And we are very clear about letting them know that we are not professionals. We are just simply one of them. And we may not be actively grieving a particular loss as facilitators, but we're very quick to say that we are not health professionals. In fact, we encourage them to get regular professional health care, and we encourage them, if they're not moving forward with their grief, that they very well may need to see a professional counselor to get some help with that, because sometimes people do need that.
Well, let's talk about some practical things. That's the emphasis of this show, to try to give people some tools. Whether you ever start a grief support group, whether you're ever part of one, we're trying to give you some things if you're grieving or if you know of others who are grieving, how to support them. Teresa, one of the things in the booklet, the participant guide that goes along with the Seasons program, is a list of 6 needs of mourning. Tell us a little bit about what those are. And again, before we jump into this, just again in brief, you gave us a little bit on the distinction between grief and mourning. Tell us again what mourning specifically refers to.
Okay, mourning is actually the act of expressing the pain that we experience when we encounter a significant loss and experience grief. So it can be crying, it can be talking, moaning, sighing, but also other things, writing. Writing is very therapeutic. And so mourning, we take the time in any way expression. In fact, in our group today, we talked about the value of music and taking time to either make music or listen to music that actually allows them to express their feelings about the loss that they've encountered. Art. Taking the time to draw out something that maybe is significant in their loss. Many different ways, but it's that expressing the grief that's automatically there. Grief is normal. Mourning is what helps us heal from the grief.
So let's talk about these 6 needs then. So can you walk us through, I mean, not that we have to go through all 6 of them, but what would you say is the theme or maybe some key take-home messages for someone who is going through grief? How should they mourn, if we were to say it that way?
There's no right or wrong way to do things. It's the only thing is not to do it. The foundation we use are the 6 needs of mourning that were actually taken from Dr. Alan Wolfelt. He has been a prolific writer on the topic of grief and loss. And so this particular one spoke to me, spoke to the writers. And so need number 1 is simply acknowledging the reality of the death. Many of us sit and we just can't believe it. And so we tailor our groups to help them to be able to accept the reality of the death. And that may sound kind of silly, but the reality is sometimes we stay in denial for a long time. But we do need to eventually acknowledge that this person, if it's a death of a loved one, that this person has actually died. And number 2 is we need to take time to embrace the pain of the loss. And sometimes I compare it to hugging a porcupine. We don't necessarily want to do it, but it's necessary for us to be able to feel. As I mentioned before, you have to feel to heal. Number 3 is we want to remember the person who died. And we want to remember them. We don't ever want to forget them. If they were important to us and we're grieving that loss, we've got to remember the things that we want to hold in our hearts while we let the pain dissipate. And the 4th need is developing a new self-identity, because sometimes our identities are really formed around our relationships. And so if we lose somebody significant to death, we question, well, who am I now? I'm not sure where I fit into the scheme of the social structure. So we take some time for that. Need number 5 is searching for meaning and purpose. And that really is a spiritual issue. What is the meaning of life, and what is my purpose in life? Those are deep issues. And then need number 6 is the need to receive ongoing support from others. We don't want to go through this experience alone. We need the social connections. We are by nature gregarious. We need each other. We were born into families. It's just the way, the divine plan of things.
So basically, that's what we're talking about, getting support from other people. Teresa, we appreciate you giving support to my listening audience. And we want to talk about some of these other specific strategies that can help us on this journey. One of the things I found especially fascinating in the manual is you have a section that is entitled Grief is Remembered Joy. And I think that's kind of a counterintuitive way of talking about grief. Can you help us through that and why it's important for folks to understand this?
Well, in order to get to the place where you actually have those memories that bring you joy, it's important to recognize that the pain that we're experiencing is because we've been robbed of that joy, and we feel that we've been robbed. And so sometimes when people think about grief, they don't think about the fact that the reason they're grieving is because this person brought so much joy into their life. And we want that joy to be able to surface. And so it's just a reminder of that. And although it doesn't take away the pain, perhaps it can bring some comfort to know that it's okay to grieve. It's necessary to mourn the grief that you're feeling, because it's really the joy that that person brought to you that is triggering your grief.
I guess that's the difficult thing, Teresa. So help me understand this, because I could see the value of saying you don't want to just forget the person. You've had all these good experiences. It's not wrong to try to relive those, but then you hear the flip side of the person says, well, whenever I think of them, I think of how much I'm missing them. So how do we navigate that process of celebrating? Sometimes people say we don't want a funeral, we want a memorial, we want to celebrate their life. But at the same time, we have that dynamic of, well, but that's bringing up the pain of loss. So how do we help people in that process?
We accompany them because we can't really fix it. And I'll tell you, as a nurse, I want to fix everything. And what we've come to realize and understand is that people need to be companioned through their grief. And many of them describe grief as like it's a tangled ball of emotions. The pain, the pleasure, the sense of so many emotions. There can be anger. It's a tangled ball of emotions. And the untangling of that ball takes time. And how we wish we could just fix it. You know, we can just drive through place where we could just get it all fixed. But it takes time. It is a process. And we have to encourage ourselves as well as others to give that space. But like I say, we have to give it enough attention so that it can heal. We can't just ignore it. But it isn't a quick process.
Now, one of the other things that, I'll frame it this way perhaps. I can remember as a physician getting training in the grief process of learning how to deal with patients. And years ago in my medical training, they exposed us to Dr. Kubler-Ross, some of the early work in grief. And we were told there were these stages of grief, starting with, as we talked about, denial. People couldn't accept the loss, and then, anger and bargaining, and kind of walking us through this whole construct. And as I've listened to people who've worked with the grieving process and they've looked at that structure, they've said, well, but it's not just linear. You don't get to this point finally of acceptance. And so the question is, when we're talking about these real life things, and probably the thing that highlights this more than anything is when you talk with people about anniversaries, or you talk about holidays, or especially meaningful times in life. So help me understand. You've put something together here that you call the 3 C's for holiday grief. So first of all, why is that something that's of special concern? And how does this relate to this whole thing of grief not necessarily being linear? You don't just get over it and, oh, hey, I'm done with my grieving and now I can live the rest of my life.
Yes, first of all, address the stages that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross defined. And first of all, her work was stellar, but she was studying the dying. She was identifying different aspects of what they went through when they were dying. And she called it stages, but later she said she regretted that because people took it like was a step ladder kind of thing. But we've come to discover that's not. You can circle around and around through these various stages and hop back and forth. So more like phases maybe, but stages kind of gave it that sort of a linear interpretation. But again, she was studying the dying. She wasn't studying the people who were survivors of those who had died. So we've added more to that process because we go on living after our loved one dies. And we've actually identified that there is a possibility that we can even grow through loss when we take time to mourn those losses. And then the next time we talk about the 3 C's, which Dr. Kenneth Doka actually created, and it's for getting through the calendar.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about this. We do have to step away just briefly. So you're listening to Teresa Nelson. She's the developer of the program that's called Seasons, Moving Through the Changes of Grief and Loss. I'm Dr. David DeRose, your host. We're going to be back with more on today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. We'll be back right after these messages.
American Indian and Alaska Native Living will continue in a moment. If you have questions or comments about today's pre-recorded broadcast, please contact us on the web at aianl.org or call 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673.
A message from the National Police Association. It used to be that any able-bodied person would offer to assist a police officer in danger. Now, passers-by are more likely to take a video. There's a better use for your phone when an officer's in trouble. Call 911. Tell the operator where you are and what you see. Then, start your video to provide evidence later. To learn more about how you can assist law enforcement, visit nationalpolice.org. That's nationalpolice.org.
Unlike other health concerns, mental illness is not always easy to see. Depression won't show up on an eye chart, and you can't measure it on your bathroom scale. Sorting out a mental health concern is not something to attempt on your own. You won't find a bipolar disorder by looking at a thermometer. Like many other health conditions, help for mental illness takes professional diagnosis and treatment. Anxiety won't just go away under a stick-on bandage. So the sooner you seek treatment, the better. If you or a loved one has a mental health concern, don't go it alone. Find out what to do. For 24-hour free and confidential information and treatment referral, call 1-800-662-HELP. Learn more at samhsa.gov/support. That's samhsa.gov/support.
Using meth taught me everything about freedom, only not like you think. It taught me how easy it is to lose your freedom. If you think meth is taking control of you, ask for help. You have the power to be truly free. I know. I'm Jan, and I'm free from meth.
If you or someone you know is struggling with meth, call 1-800-662-HELP for 24-hour free and confidential treatment referral. Learn more at samhsa.gov/meth.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back to the second half of today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Dr. David DeRose outdoors in Columbia, Maryland with Teresa Nelson. She is a nurse. She is the developer of a program called Seasons, moving through the changes of grief and loss. She's been training people here in this venue to actually be community support people throughout the country and beyond. But here on this radio show, we're especially giving you some of those insights to help you, perhaps in your own time of grief, or to help you as you deal with other people in the workplace, in the tribe, in the community settings that you find yourself, in your family as they're dealing with loss, navigating that whole journey. Teresa, before we stepped away, we were talking about how grief is not linear. It can be somewhat cyclic, and one of the things that seems to highlight that are these anniversaries, whether it's a wedding anniversary, whether it's a birthday, whether it's the holidays. You have a section here that is especially devoted to holiday grief. Tell us why you thought that was important to include it in your participant guide.
During the grieving period, many times we experience what Teresa Rando is another really respected author on the topic of grief and loss. Teresa Rando talks about STUGS, and STUGS is just an acronym for Sudden Temporary Upsurge of Grief. A STUG, that's what it is. And some call it a grief attack or whatever, a wave of something just comes over them. They think they're getting better, and then things just seem like they're going into reverse because, again, that cycle comes when they have that acute pain and loss. And oftentimes it happens around the calendar. So we discussed the fact that there's a calendar to grief, and certain dates on the calendar can really activate that STUG. Christmas. When you think about Christmas or any particular holiday that's important to family and they gather to celebrate, it's going to bring memories because that relationship was a part of that celebration. And so we try to get people to think about maybe things that might be coming up on the calendar that they might need to prepare for. So I'd like to share what Dr. Kenneth Doka, who has written prolifically for the Hospice Foundation of America, has put what he calls the 3 C's of grief for holidays. A holiday is any special day. It's any special day to you. A wedding anniversary or a particular time of year that you would go on vacation together. Anything that stands out in your mind. This time at this year, we would be doing this or that together. And so he says one of the things, particularly if you're going to be at a gathering, like maybe a Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday, is that you would choose how you want to spend that time. And that you make those choices so that you allow yourself some flexibility. So you say, I'm going to maybe do here, but I want to kind of make sure that if I change my mind, I don't have to do that. Say, I'm going to plan on it, but if something comes up, so some kind of a way of escape, that if it's too painful for you, you decide you don't want to go. You can exercise your power of choice over how you spend that day and recognize that it is coming up. And the other thing is there's going to probably likely that there'll be other people involved in that event. And so you want to have a discussion with them because very likely there's other people, particularly in your family, that may be grieving as well. And so having some communication and say, for instance, maybe a father has passed away and we're dealing with somebody who has also lost a spouse, but they've also lost their father. We talk as a family. How do we want to choose? Because other family members may have different ideas about how to honor that day. And then we recognize that when you're dealing with other people, there's going to need to be some compromises. And so there may be a time when you say, well, we used to do this, but can we compromise and do this instead? I heard one story about how they always put up a big Christmas tree and they compromised and they just couldn't bear the thought of having a great big Christmas tree. It was just too painful for them to look at that and know that their loved one wasn't there. So they said, maybe we'll just have a small tree. And so they put it somewhere else in a different place in the house. So making those compromises when you've got other people involved in it. Those 3 C's are choosing, communicating, and compromising. And those are helpful. And what we found is that if people think about it ahead of time, they usually go through the day in much better shape than if it just kind of took them unawares. I'm going to stick my head in the sand and pretend it's not going to happen, and then it just kind of runs in like a flood. We've heard some stories about how that doesn't go so well. One nice thing, Dr. DeRose, about a group is that they learn from each other. It is amazing to watch how one griever can help other grievers as they work through those passages. And some of them, they're at all different stages, but they all can identify because they know what a broken heart feels like.
So the take-home message I hear about this dimension, Teresa, is that folks should be cognizant of times of the year that might be challenging. And so be thinking right now, if you're listening into this show and you've recently lost someone, maybe it's the first go around. Maybe you haven't had that person's birthday come around the calendar yet, or maybe that anniversary hasn't come up, or that special holiday. So having a plan is what I hear you saying as you're coming to those momentous days.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's easy to stick your head in the sand, but we hear enough stories of people that did that and didn't have the best outcome when the day came because they hadn't communicated and everybody had different ideas about what to do or not to do. And they didn't really exercise their power of choice and they weren't able to work through compromises ahead of time. So advanced planning is usually a good thing.
So, Teresa, I've noticed with this manual, it's very practical. You have a calendar here in the manual where people can jot down specific dates that may be challenging for them. But across from this calendar, you've got a poem, and it's entitled Thoughts on an Anniversary. Why did you think it was important to include this in the manual?
Well, actually, I included it because grievers had read it and they really liked it. And I'd seen it somewhere. And so I wanted it included in the manual because it had been well received. People could relate to it. Would you like me to read it?
Please. That would be wonderful.
Okay. So this is titled Thoughts on an Anniversary. And keep in mind it's an anniversary of any significant date, just not a wedding anniversary. An anniversary is something that rolls around annually. It's true that the loss of my loved one is always on the back of my mind, but not always on my mind. When I think of my loved one now, I remember them warmly, and I rarely cry anymore out of hurt or anger. But there are times when something can throw me right back to that very day, and the depth of my feeling of loss and pain once again equal the depth of my love for them. And I cry, and I hurt. But it reminds me all the more that my loved one will always be a part of my life, and is special enough to care about. Time has healed me, but time has not made me forget.
I think that's the tension we've been speaking about, Teresa, in the program, is that balance between memorializing and thinking positively about the loved one, thinking of those fond times, but at the same time not dwelling in the sense of loss. And as you mentioned earlier, it's this complex tangle of emotions, even years after the loss.
Yes, and it does take time, and it's so individual. And we do encourage our participants to not compare. Every loss is so different. and the timelines are so different. And I learned several years ago that the intensity of your grief is largely conditional on two things. One is the closeness that you had with the person that died, and also the amount of unfinished business. And those two things kind of made that equation for maybe intensity and also perhaps time. But as humans, we are all so unique and individual. And so we don't compare. We don't put timelines. We just simply walk with people and help them while they're journeying through that season.
I really resonate with this concept of unfinished business because I've encountered many people over the years where you'll hear something like, well, this close person died and, I hadn't addressed this, or we had this misunderstanding. And it's kind of shocking to me, actually, as a physician, how many people that have these close relationships where they're totally distant from the person and there's regrets or there's concerns. So if we're thinking about individuals who maybe are not grieving, but we're talking about this topic, what can we do preventively as far as our relationships so that we don't have unfinished business? Is this something that you talk about in these groups or not?
Actually, I don't need to talk about it. The group talks about it. They talk about what they'd wish they'd done, the woulda, shoulda, couldas. And guilt and the subject of forgiveness always gets brought up, and they struggle with that. But they say, I am determined that I am not going to have any kind of dissension or division with my loved ones, and I'm going to remember to say I love you, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. So sometimes, and I think that's a growth point. If we could all treat each other that way, that we don't leave those kinds of things behind. But when we talk about unfinished business, it's not always a situation where there was some kind of fracture in the relationship or harsh words or whatever. Unfinished business could just as well be applied to a child who dies. Talk about unfinished business. I hadn't finished raising my child yet. I had a lot of things to do. I had a lot of plans for that child. And so those things that get interrupted and aborted early can be difficult to process because you had so many plans and a future that was denied. So unfinished business can be very difficult, but it's not always negative unfinished. It's just simply, I didn't get to do the things with my loved one that we really had planned to do.
And I think that's another one that I think a lot of people can relate to because it seems like I've sometimes said this in professional circles. I don't know that I've said this to patients. Maybe I shouldn't be saying it on air, but I've said that no one dies at the right time. And sometimes I'll have patients that are saying to me, or maybe family members are saying, well, why doesn't mom or dad just die? They've had this lingering cancer and their quality of life is so terrible, or they have severe dementia. Why do they keep hanging on? They are bemoaning the fact that they're still alive, not because they didn't love them, but because they see the pain or what they think is the futility of their life. And then, of course, at other times, it doesn't matter how old the person is. They could be 95 or 105. And the person says, but, they were still taking care of themselves. It's so tragic that we've lost them. They were such a resource in the community, this esteemed elder maybe in the tribe. And so it kind of brings us back to the point that it seems like on some level, there's often unfinished business unless it had gotten to the point where someone is actually sometimes even calling out to God saying, why is this person still going through this turmoil? And even then, sometimes I've kind of wondered, do people have regrets about the whole circumstances of death? What do you find about this when someone has dealt with these terminal illnesses, these long lingering illnesses or chronic diseases where they feel like the loved one went through so much pain and suffering, and even though the person's now gone, they're trying to come to resolution with all that they suffered? How do we help people in that process?
We let them talk. And if you really just attend to them and you allow them to talk uninterrupted and you provide that listening ear, they will eventually come to their own understanding and find peace, but you have to give them space to do that. I can give you a personal example. My mother died an early death in terms of average life expectancy. My father lived up in years, and he got dementia, and he got to the point where his quality of life was very poor. And I actually prayed that he would die soon because his quality of life was so bad. He didn't know anybody, wasn't capable of doing anything for himself. And yet after he died, I grieved so hard, and it shocked me because I thought I kind of knew that I'd already pre-grieved a lot of things, but I grieved and cried. I remember just crying very loudly, and I had a wonderful pastor come to see me, and he said something about how we're always going to grieve because we're never ready to let go. Care how old they are or what their situation is. The heart was made for relationship. The heart was made really, eternity is set in our hearts. And that brought me a lot of understanding, which brought me peace.
We do have to step away one last time. We're going to come back. We've got some great material coming up in the final segment, talking about how helping others can be part of the healing process. Teresa Nelson is staying by. We're talking about seasons, moving through the changes of grief and loss. Stay tuned. Final segment coming up right after this.
Today's broadcast has been pre-recorded. However, if you have questions about today's show or would like further information, please call 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. We'll be right back after this.
If a natural disaster comes knocking, how prepared is your family? You can't just close the door on earthquakes, floods, or hurricanes and hope they go away. That's why it's important to make a plan now. Ready.gov/plan has the tools and tips you need to prepare your family for an emergency. So if disaster shows up at your doorstep, you'll be ready. Visit ready.gov/plan and make a plan today. Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
I'm just texting him back. I'm just posting a story. I'm just changing the song.
No. When it comes to distracted driving, just don't. Sending a text takes your eyes off the road for just 5 seconds, but in that time, your car can travel the length of an entire football field. Any distracted driving just isn't worth it.
Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A message brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Project Yellow Light, and the Ad Council.
What is a number story?
My number story started with fear and a lack of support, and it has led me to be there for others.
A number story begins in our childhood with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
My number story begins with the separation from my father and the emotional abandonment from my mother, and leads to me being a role model to not only myself, but those around me by becoming the person that wasn't there for me.
ACEs are so common, 2/3 of us have one.
My number story begins with drug abuse and homelessness, and leads to realizing that I can live life by my own standards.
A study found the more ACEs, the more likely we may experience a host of serious health effects, physical and mental, but that doesn't need to be the case. Your ACE number is simply an entry point to your own story. Where it leads is up to you.
My number story begins with years of emotional abuse and leads to peace, clarity, and security in my self-worth.
Take control of where your number story leads at numberstory.org.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back for our final segment of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. I'm Dr. David DeRose. We are outside in Columbia, Maryland, where we have been. Both Teresa and I have been training individuals in different community programs. I've been working with things as diverse as diabetes and high blood pressure, but we're focusing in this program on what Teresa was training folks in. She's training them in a curriculum called Seasons, moving through the changes of grief and loss. Some of the folks who weren't there may be wanting to access these materials. They may be wanting to use it for their community group. They may want to facilitate a group. Tell us again how someone can get these materials.
The material is available on a website called adventsource.org. And on that website, if you just type in seasons and perhaps add the word grief, it will pull up and you'll be able to see the material that's there. There is a coordinator guide. There's a participant guide. There is a facilitator guide. And also there is a USB that allows you to access some short PowerPoints that you can show if you want to show some slides and facilitate a grief group. It's also some really wonderful short videos that really target the things that we want to have the participants consider as they move through that season of grief.
Let's talk about this USB drive. What kind of video resources do you have, and how does that help with this whole process?
It actually kind of primes the participants to think about the things that we want them to consider, and it actually sparks the discussion. I will tell you, Dr. DeRose, that what they enjoy the most, or what they have said is helped them the most at this season of their life, is being able to share. And so we want the videos to be very short and targeted so that it prompts them to begin sharing. Helps to prime the pump. Just like as you're interviewing me, you're helping me by asking questions and helping me to engage in this conversation. The video helps them to engage in conversations together because it will help them to look at their grief and be able to really mourn and express their feelings.
Excellent. So again, the program is called Seasons, Moving Through the Changes of Grief and Loss. It's available at adventsource.org. Teresa, we promised our listeners that we'd talk about this, somewhat counterintuitive aspect. People may want to pull away from their grief. They may not want to share it. But one of the things you talk about in some of the concluding material is how helping others can actually help ourselves through this grieving process. So tell us a little bit about why catching that vision is so important.
Well, I believe strongly, and I think most of our listeners would agree, that we need meaning and purpose in our lives, and we all need things that get us out of the bed in the morning and get us moving. And when you look at nature, just sitting out in nature and looking it up at all these trees, the trees give off oxygen. We give the trees carbon dioxide. You look at the ebb and flow of life, and all of nature testifies to the giving and receiving aspect. And to be truly alive is to be in that process of giving and receiving. And so we encourage our grievers to think about ways that they might give, even just showing up to grief group. I tell them, when you come to grief group, you're giving. You are sharing your pain with somebody else, and they may not feel like that's a very good gift to give, but it is, because people know that they're not the only one in pain, and it's comforting to them. So we help them to understand that giving actually helps that process, helps them to feel better, and helps to mitigate their pain. And we talk about ways that they might do that. And as they move deeper into that season of grief and they begin to actually move through it, they begin to do more and more giving. And so we try to help them to understand that that's very, very important. And it's not a hard sell. They understand that. And they want to give, but sometimes they're so sad that they're not sure they have anything to give. So we try to encourage them, and the group encourages each other. So it is a way that we can actually help ourselves to be able to give. And I see that all the time.
So if I understand this correctly, if someone is using this curriculum, it's a 10-session program, is that right?
That's right. That's a 10-session program. And this particular type of sharing, because it is a heartfelt sharing, it's a closed group. So we let new participants come for the first 3 weeks. We give them a chance if there's somebody that misses the first one or the second one. But after the third week, we close it because the group begins to bond together. And it's too disruptive to have somebody come in the middle and try to catch up. So it's really geared for allowing for really some close sharing as people begin to trust each other. We have guidelines for the group so they understand the importance of confidentiality. We teach them to avoid advice giving and to accept what everyone shares and taking turns. So as facilitators, our role is to keep the group safe and to give them an opportunity to actually explore their loss and find ways that they can move through that season. So that's our chief role. But the group, they kind of help provide that therapy, per se, if we want to call it that, but it's a healing process that they find is very helpful.
So we've been sharing some of the highlights from your program, from the Seasons program. And when someone goes through this full 10-week program, they've gone through the sharing and all, I see as they get to the last session, there's a section called Weaving Our Loss into Gain. And I noticed that the first bullet point, as you go through these suggestions for, quote, weaving loss into gain, is an interesting one. Before we get there, though, why this phrase, weaving loss into gain?
Well, the reason we use the term weaving is because I don't know if any of our listeners have heard the term, we need closure. And many grievers reject that philosophy because we don't want to close the book on our loved one. It sort of gives that connotation that we just forget about them and move on, because the heart does not forget about a loved one. They stay in our memories, in our hearts and minds. And we continue to carry that love forward. So the weaving helps us to understand that we weave that loss into the fabric of our lives, and we carry that forward, not in a painful way, but in a way that helps us to be able to have a life that's more meaningful and more joyful, and to maybe not take so much for granted, especially when it comes to relationships. So the weaving word is very significant because we don't want to forget about them. We want to figure out, how do I go on without my loved one and weave that into such a way that I can have even a more meaningful life than I had last year or the year before, the year before that.
Now, the first bullet point is something that I resonate with because I've worked with a lot of people in these, structured programs as well. I, especially with chronic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure, where we'll ask people to go on a 30-day journey, for example. And as we get to the end of that journey, I do often say something, like you have in this first bullet point, and that is, even though we've only asked them to commit for 30 days or 10 weeks or whatever it's been, then you have a bullet point, suggestions for weaving loss into gain, consider enrolling in another grief recovery group. And here's the question, Teresa, because it seems like there's this tension. On one hand, you said, hey, we're just asking you to carve out a month or 10 weeks. And now we're talking about another program. What is the rationale for mentioning that? And then why is that not some kind of bait and switch, telling someone it's just a short thing and then you're trying to get them to stay on for longer?
Well, we really respect their choice and their freedom to do what they want. But what we have found is that many people that come are not ready to let go of what they have found in the group. So we want to invite them to come back. It is completely up to them whether they come back. I tell them that they get to self-graduate when they feel like they no longer need to come and spend some time processing their grief, talking about their grief, sharing that, and in that sharing and caring environment that they can do so. But I find a lot of them will come back and re-enroll, but there's no bait and switch to it. We tell them, you come as often as you need to, and a lot of them will right away, when are you doing another one? Because we can't say grief is over. I need to mourn longer than 10 weeks. And so they may have a really strong support system, and maybe 10 weeks is enough for them because they've got a really good supportive network. But we find that some of our people don't have that supportive network, and this becomes the supportive network for them. So we invite them to come back, and when they're to the point where they're no longer needing to talk a lot about their loss, they'll move on their own. We don't force them to come or pressure them to come. We don't tell them to exit either. We want to be there for them. So we'll take a break for a few weeks and then we'll reconvene again.
Yeah, I like that model where it's not just continuous. You do finish after 10 weeks and then people can jump back onto the next session that may be starting a few weeks later. Our time has pretty much slipped away from us, Teresa. You've been great sharing practical insights for us because all of us deal with grief, as you mentioned earlier in the show. Tell us one more time the full name of the program and how someone can get the resources if they just want them to use personally or if they want to help others on this journey.
Okay, so the program is called Seasons, Moving Through the Changes of Grief and Loss. These are the materials that we provide primarily for someone who wants to facilitate a small group that is peer supported and just basically facilitate the group. Again, you don't have to be a professional. You just have a heart that wants to serve and want to maybe get a little bit of education on how to do that. And you can get the material through adventsource.org. Again, it's adventsource.org. And if you just type in seasons and then the word grief, it will pull up for you.
Wonderful. So just remember adventsource.org, the program called Seasons. Teresa Nelson is the lead author of the program, and I have been so grateful to have you as our guest out here in Maryland, right near the freeway on what feels like a summer's day at the end of April of 2024. Thank you so much, Teresa, for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. DeRose. It was a pleasure to be here with you and your wife, Dr. Sonia DeRose.
And thank you to each one of you who have joined us for today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. As always, I'm Dr. David DeRose, wishing you the very best of health.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.